Hello, everybody. My name is Pharaoh Saunders with the Racial Justice Collaborative, and thank you for attending our fifth Juneteenth event. What is the cost of forgetting? Black history is so intertwined with American history that it's completely incapable of being removed from the other without irreparably damaging the whole. Black history has been tethered to the wealth, the political will, and the cultural foundations of the United States ever since we first arrived in the country. And the history surrounding our circumstances, thusly, are just as foundational. A really important thing to remember about this concept is that historical memory is not passive, it is not automatic. People in the modern day are required to exalt the progress that came before in order to hold on to the gains that were made. Because if they're left to fall to the backdrop of the past, rather than carried into the future, they will be forgotten. These lessons need to be maintained, they need to be cherished, or they'll fade so severely that eventually they'll just be gone in their entirety, along with all the progress that came with them. The Black-led civil rights movement was one of the most important events in all of American history. It carved the path to the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, laws that now guard the dignity of women, of immigrants, the disabled, and the poor. To forget the struggles and circumstances that led to the granting of these rights is to risk losing them. Justice didn't suddenly appear one day or fall from the sky at random. It rose from the streets, from sit-ins and boycotts, and a decade of organized efforts. And we dishonor that legacy every time we look away from it. Justice was fought for, it was bled for, it was won through sheer determination. And when we erase the history of those struggles, we don't just dishonor the legacy, but we're endangering our future as well. The 14th and 15th Amendments, born of blood and fire, etched into law the sacred promise of equal citizenship, and not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans. These rights, which have paved the way to millions of future families being able to start new lives in the United States with dignity and with security, regardless of their race and regardless of the nation of their origin, only came about as a result of the Civil War, which was fought over the political battle between the abolition or the continuance of the enslaved status of Black people in the United States. To erase the Black history that gives context to why these rights exist is to weaken the history of our democracy itself, because this is such a foundational chapter of it. Someone cannot claim to love the freedoms of this country while disregarding the history of the people so tied to the context of how these freedoms came about in the first place. Black Americans contributed immensely to the construction of this country, in senses both literal and metaphorical, in fields and factories, on battlefields, both in war and in labor. Black unions were not footnotes, but were instead extremely historically important to the progress on the front of labor rights across racial lines. In situations where labor organizations excluded Black membership, Black Americans were forced to organize among themselves, forming their own labor groups to protect their workers when larger white labor unions excluded them. Despite the segregation, however, the contributions of Black labor unions in the late 1800s and turn of the century still greatly contributed to the broader causes of labor groups across all racial lines, as the power that these groups wielded benefited from class solidarity even when certain white labor groups were not willing to integrate racially. They still distantly benefited from the efforts that groups that they would not socialize with produced. Later on, however, towards the 1930s, various economic factors such as swells in labor demands for large-scale projects like FDR's new shipbuilding programs were so large in scale that some unions, choosing to remain racially segregated, was simply inefficient, as the limited pool for the workforce was unable to keep up with these larger demands. On the other hand, unions that did integrate racially in this era were better able to adapt to these new conditions and this new class solidarity between workers, easing the tensions between working class peoples of different races only strengthened the labor union as a whole. Erasing this history is not just distortion, it's theft, and it leaves our understanding of American labor hollow, incomplete, and vulnerable in the modern day. While forgetting knowledge over generations may be passive, environments that purposefully speed up the process through intentional erasure are oftentimes intentionally orchestrated. These efforts prop up myths of American innocence while silencing centuries of truth struggled for by true patriots. But truth is not our enemy, it is our salvation. Without truth, there can be no justice. Without truth, there can be no healing. And without healing, we're a nation doomed to bleed the same old wounds. This is not an accident. From the eugenics movements of the early 1900s that used biased IQ tests to completely fabricated pseudoscience like phrenology to label black children as inferior, to today's efforts to ban lessons on systemic racism or the histories of racism throughout countries, anti-blackness is built into efforts to obfuscate the truth. But again, truth is not our enemy. It is the only foundation that can be used to build a common good. Without truth, there can be no justice. Without justice, no healing. Without healing, we remain trapped in the same cycles of harm again and again and again. Black culture has been the origin point of American cultural trends and phenomenon that have grown to be scores of the most beloved forms of art and traditions, not only all of our country, but of the entire world. It's a fusion of African and European foods that were cooked. It's jazz, blues, rock, hip hop, all birthed from combinations of African and European musical stylings, traditions, and innovations to create new world-sweeping genres of music. It's in innovations that are central or ubiquitous, things that are so common and taken for granted in the modern day that countless people don't know where they came from. Blood banks, refrigerated trucks, the three-light traffic signal. To erase Black excellence is to erase America's greatest songs, some of its greatest minds, and some of its greatest triumphs. Yet, for a long time, there have been efforts, some quiet and some loud, to separate many of these cultural achievements from their originators, with varying levels of success depending on what you're looking at. But like it was said earlier, to forget is passive. And again, it takes active exaltation of these histories and of these truths in order to maintain them. Cultural trends tied to anti-blackness reinforces to new immigrants that to be more American means to adopt these same prejudices, distancing themselves from blackness or moving closer to whiteness in order to attempt to secure their place in a system built on exclusion. However, the doors opened by black liberation struggles were not narrow. Immigration reform, gender equality, disability rights all walked through these doors opened by black resistance. We rise together or we fall separately. The struggles for freedom led by black leaders in the United States has always made more freedom possible for everyone. So many movements for justice found their footing because black liberation struggles paved the way historically. Because forgetting is a natural byproduct of apathy, it takes active effort to remember the truths of history. And there is strength, pride, and humility all in one, and remembering that the lessons of the past are one of our greatest inheritances. This is why we gather for our fifth annual Juneteenth celebration to honor the legacy of the Black experience in America. We refuse erasure, we embrace truth. All of this is American history. Thank you. My name is Pharaoh Saunders, and I really appreciate you coming to our fifth Juneteenth event.